faith communities of Atlanta and of this country and of the world. We could have many speakers here who are amazing orators. And at the end of the day, you would have met an amazing orator. Perhaps a large ego. The speech would be as much about them as it would be about the subject. You won't have that with King MLK. You have here a man who is a genuine man of faith, a humble servant of the living God, who serves in whatever capacity he is asked to serve as an agent of reconciliation. He and I have traveled together, taken groups together to Turkey, to Spain, to Morocco, to Gibraltar, Toronto. And I've seen him function in so many ways. We prayed in hotel hallways at 3 in the morning. We prayed, we've eaten together in restaurants, and I have seen that he is a pastor, to use a Christian term, to everyone, not just to Muslims, but to all of us. Reaching out to us, caring for us, nurturing our own spirituality. And I have become a better Christian because I know this good friend, Clement El-Amin. I met him in September of 2001. September 11, we were all of us traumatized. And we felt the need to be together in prayer on that evening. And I did have a rabbi friend. I had moved to Atlanta not too much before that. And I had a couple African-American friends, and we organized a service, but we realized that none of us knew any Muslims in Atlanta. That's scandalous, actually. There was, I think, 17 mosques at the time. I think there are 30 or more now. But we didn't. And so we reached out, and he was already reaching out to the rest of us to be involved in organizing. Atlanta today is a model of interfaith cooperation. There are layers and interlocking organizations, World Pilgrims, Interfaith Children's Movement, Faith Alliance in Metro Atlanta, Interfaith Community Initiatives. He's at the bottom of all of them. He's making them happen. He's such a visionary and a doer, and yet such a humble servant of the living God. It is an honor and a pleasure to introduce you to a genuine human being, one of the model human beings on the planet. Come on up, Clement.
In the name of God, merciful benefactor, merciful Redeemer. I'd like to thank all of you for sharing this time with us this morning. I'd like to thank the board of Faith Bridge for their trust in Bud Frank Jones and his recommendation that I would come here to speak to you on this very, very special Monday, a very special Monday in my life. I also like to thank you for bringing me out of I think we have 50-degree weather. But it also gives me a chance to be with my son and his wife and their 2 children who live here in Chicago, so I thank you for that. He's here with us this morning. You may pick up my southern accent, and as the temperature drops outside, it gets heavier and Dr. King has been a huge influence in my life as a Muslim, as an imam, as an interfaith activist, and as a human being living in a global reality. I'm a citizen of the world, as I often say. I didn't know him person to person. I was 18 when he was assassinated. Now, age differences, sort of, because I'm young at that point, and because Atlanta has 4 African-American colleges and African-American graduate school, and African-American School of Theology that has 6 different schools within it, Dr. King did not use high school students in Atlanta. In Mississippi, in Alabama, South Carolina, high school students were part of the civil rights movement and the protest movement. But in Atlanta, it had so many college students that high school students were not utilized. He went to the same high school I went to, Booker T. Washington High. My high school girlfriend's backyard abutted his backyard. It was like a 10 to 15-minute walk from my house to his house. I came to know later Coretta Scott King quite well. One of his mentors, Benjamin E. Mays, I came to know quite well as Ralph David Abernathy, and most of Dr. King's close supporters and friends, such as Andy Young, C.T. Vivian. I'm very close with all of them now. All of Dr. King's children are a little younger than I am. His oldest daughter, who's no longer with us, she was at Smith, Mount Holyoke, when I was at Harvard. I was a senior and she was a freshman. And so I'm very familiar with his family. I also came to know Daddy King, who said about his son, he was a genius. He said, I'm not talking about my son when I say that, I'm talking about a world citizen. He moved beyond us early. He did not belong to us, he belonged to the world. And this is my focus for this morning, to look at Dr. King a little differently, perhaps. To know him again, or perhaps to come to know him for the first time as beyond that speech, which was one of the greatest speeches ever, in many of our opinions, in August of 1963 in the March on Washington. But oftentimes, he is frozen and ossified in that speech and in that particular dream. He was a dreamer, but he was not a sleeper. He was a man who was awake, as my Buddhist friends would say. He was awake. Awake to God, awake to truth, and awake to the interconnectedness of our humanity, of brotherhood and sisterhood. 1 year after that great speech, Dr. King received the Nobel Peace Prize. And there he said, as one of our young speeches alluded to, he said, I have the audacity to believe that people everywhere can have 3 meals a day for their bodies, education and culture for their minds, and dignity, equality, and freedom for their spirits. He later said that the Nobel Peace Prize was a commission to work harder than he had ever worked before for the brotherhood and sisterhood of humanity. He said that it was a calling that took him beyond national allegiances. The calling was one beyond that of race, beyond that of nation, beyond that of creed. It was a calling to the God of all and to the service of humanity. Dr. King said of this calling that this is the privilege and the burden of all of us who deem ourselves bound by allegiances and loyalties which are broader and deeper than nationalism, and which go beyond our nation's self-defined goals and positions. We are called, he said, to speak for the weak, for the voiceless, for the victims of our nation, for those our nation calls its enemies. For no document written from human hands can make these humans any less our brothers. You can imagine imagine the general reaction, and some of us are old enough to clearly remember the general public reaction. Many people say, oh, he's a communist. You know, communist is the old term that now the term is terrorist. But also within the civil rights movement, it didn't sit that well. Civil rights leaders, for the most part, did not want to be involved in foreign and international affairs. Their thought was that Negro Americans, Black Americans' freedom was strictly a domestic issue. And in fact, the leaders in the civil rights movement, especially the African American ones, supported U.S. foreign policy in the name of anti-communism and accepted U.S. covert interventions and wars in Africa and in Asia in order to prevent, supposedly, Soviet influences from spreading. They even told the U.S. government leaders, if you treat Negroes better, if you treat blacks better, and give us our civil rights, doors will open for you in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, because then they'll be able to trust you. That was the general perspective of civil rights leaders. In fact, there was a civil rights leader here in Chicago, a pastor of a church, and he really fell out with Dr. King about this. And later, when Chicago named the street Martin Luther King, and his front door of his church was on that street, he changed the front door of his church to the side street so his address would not be Martin Luther King Boulevard. Now, and also remember, you may not know as much about Malcolm X, but Malcolm's position, he saw himself as a proponent of human dignity and freedom, and not really of civil rights. So Malcolm was taking the African Americans' dilemma to the UN to see if he felt that it was a world dilemma and needed a world court. But after 1964 and this reception of the Nobel Peace Prize, Dr. King broke from that thinking of the civil rights leaders about not being involved in foreign issues or international issues. And by 1967, he broke his silence on Vietnam. In a speech called Beyond Vietnam, it was given at the Riverside Church in New York, to the dismay and rage of so many in and out of the civil rights movement, exactly 1 year before his assassination, to the date, April 4th, 1967, he gave the speech called Beyond Vietnam, and he said, a time comes when silence is betrayal. And he began to speak out against that war. They asked him, why are you doing this? Aren't you hurting the cause of your people, or our people even? And most of his people said, Doc, they're going to call us communists. Peace and civil rights don't mix. And he responded to them all. He said it was a mandate of conscience. And it was also from the astute reading of history. He said if America continues on this path, it will lose its soul, and a portion of the autopsy will read Vietnam. He said, I got involved in this movement to save the soul of America. He said the war in Vietnam is but a symptom of a far deeper malady within the American spirit, and if we ignore this sobering reality, we will find ourselves wrongfully engaged in Guatemala, Peru, Thailand, Cambodia, Mozambique, South Africa, and dozens of other states and nations, destroying the hopes of people the world